Hello and a very warm welcome to audiences in the UK and around the world. President Biden has been visiting the city of Tulsa in Oklahoma to mark a century since a white mob attacked a black district, killing as many as 300 people. The attack on an affluent black community known as Black Wall Street followed an alleged assault on a white teenage girl. President Biden has called on all Americans to reflect on what he described as the deep roots of racial terror in the country's history. Our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue reports from Tulsa.
This is the first time an American president has come to Tulsa to acknowledge the horror of the massacre. Local residents showed him around the Greenwood Cultural Center, where he got to meet the only known survivors of that murderous night in 1921, America's worst single act of racial violence in its history.
Some injustices are so heinous, so horrific, so grievous, they can't be buried, no matter how hard people try.
In the light of the Tulsa massacre and a year where racial injustice has been foremost following the murder of George Floyd, the president did set out his ambition to redirect federal funding to assist minority small businesses.
I'm determined to use every taxpayer's dollar that is assigned to me to spend, going to American companies and American workers that build American products. And as part of that, I'm going to increase the share of the dollars the federal government spends to small disadvantaged businesses, including black and brown small businesses.
There was little such help for Greenwood after 1921. In fact, the city purposely passed rules and regulations that would make it harder for black businesses to rebuild. It took decades for Greenwood to recover, though it never regained its former glory. But now local entrepreneurs do want to recapture that past, and they're looking to local, state and federal government to help. The Black Wall Street Liquid Lounge is one place trying to revitalise the area. But while there's optimism for its future, the owner still believes the city is divided.
I'm more of a bootstrap kind of guy, so I think that the movement starts here with the citizens and the small business owners working together.
If some are thinking about Greenwood's future, others are praying for answers about its past. Archaeologists now believe that dozens, if not hundreds of victims of the massacre were buried in mass graves, and the work to find them begins in earnest today.
I feel a sense of pride because right now we are opening up ground where there's hidden history, so dark in history. This is a murder investigation right here. Murder investigation.
The work excavating the graves will take months, if not years. Proof, if needed, that the past is rarely over. Gary O'Donoghue, BBC News, Tulsa.
Well, we can speak now to Dr. Rashawn Ray, who's a fellow at the Brookings Institution, a regular commentator on matters of historical importance to the African-American story in the United States. Very good to have you with us, Dr. Ray. Where does this sit then in the grand scheme of things, in the bigger context of the history of African-American rights in the US and the effect that that incident has on people today?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, as always. It is monumental, and it's monumental for a couple of reasons. See, Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Greenwood, what it represented was 35 blocks of black excellence, of people who had pulled themselves up from their bootstraps. There were dentists, there were other small businesses, there were movie theaters, there were homes that were all burned to the ground, where not only people lost their lives, but people also lost wealth and the ability to accumulate generational wealth. So Black Wall Street is what society, what the United States had told black people that they should do. And it's monumental today, of course, being 100 years, but also the fact that President Biden went there as one of the first sitting presidents to do so is monumental. And I think that the pathway that he's laid out in terms of legislation can help to amend the wrongs here.
Just explain that pathway for us and why it matters so much.
Yeah, so part of what people have to recognize is that after Black Wall Street was decimated, that it was not only that particular city, but there are several around the United States that were similar to Greenwood that were also decimated in similar ways by the KKK, white supremacists, and at times where law enforcement and the federal government were playing a complicit role in these acts. Now, part of what Biden is trying to address is not just those massacres, but also the legacy of them. Jim Crow, which is housing segregation, and then also business ownership, which has oftentimes prevented Black businesses from being able to gain the financial backing and to grow to help Black communities. Biden is aiming to address both of those gaps when it comes to the racial wealth gap in terms of entrepreneurship and home ownership.
For many years, the anniversary of what happened went unmarked. It was almost like it had been hidden, almost extracted from the history books. How important is it that it is now being marked, and in particular to the descendants of the people who were affected by that mob attack?
Well, look, it's vitally important. We know that there are a few people who were literally there on that day 100 years ago who have been hoping for this particular moment. We also have to recognize that when you looked at papers from that particular incident 100 years ago, it talked about the few white people who were actually the instigators, some of whom who also ended up being killed, with very little mention of Black people, of the 300 Black people who were decimated, and of course, upperly mobile and affluent Black people. And I think it highlights a legacy that we cannot outclass racism, that oftentimes the threat of upperly mobile, affluent Black people is even more so the individuals who are living a more downtrodden life. So Tulsa, Greenwood, Black Wall Street represents the best of what America and the world has to offer, but it also highlights the ways that systemic racism and white supremacy continues to unfold on American soil.
OK, Dr. Rashawn Ray from the Brookings Institution, many thanks indeed.